Hi there, and welcome to our first video on the Tempest. We're going to do these videos slightly differently to the way that we did them in class, or the way that we studied the play in class. In class, we studied the play based on key themes, and we thought that actually it might be useful to look at this play in terms of its characters and think about how the characters might link back to the themes. So we're going to do a video on Ariel and Caliban, which is today's. We're going to do two videos on Prospero, one of him at the beginning of the play, one of him at the end, and then we're also going to do a video on Miranda and Ferdinand. I know that misses out Stefano and Trinculo and it misses out the Four Nobles, but we may look at doing some more videos after half term for that. But I think for the next kind of 4 weeks, we're going to get some videos on characters in the Tempest. Through this, what I'm going to ask you to do is just make some notes about how you would talk about these characters in the play. So I'll get straight on, and we're going to think about Ariel and Caliban together. And the first thing I wanted to talk about was, like, what sort of things are we going to end up saying about Ariel and Caliban in this play? In what ways are Ariel and Caliban significant? So as you'll remember, we did study the play based on themes, and you'll recognise the themes here. And I'm just trying to look at the play kind of through a different lens. But one of the first things that we looked at was magic and spectacle in this play. So I think one of the first things we might want to talk about is, if you got a question on magic and spectacle, like that question on whether the play is just all style over substance, or a question on like the theme of magic even, or the theme of theatricality and spectacle, how might we use Ariel and Caliban for that? Well, I think Ariel is the one that we would end up talking about if we ended up writing an essay on that. And Ariel's an embodiment of the island's magic, and Ariel is also an embodiment of Prospero's power. So if we were going to talk about the significance of magic and spectacle in the play, I think Catherine Brocco, as a critic, is quite useful to us. Ariel is an actor who's repeatedly called upon to perform various actions and texts for his director, Prospero. And we see this in some key scenes, which I've shared with you on the screen there. I think the most spectacular scene of the play, and the play in which Ariel is being an actor who is called upon to perform for Prospero, is in Act 3, Scene 3, when Ariel appears as the harpy. So if you wanted to talk about the use of spectacle in this play, I think you would look at the scene with Ariel as the harpy. I think you'd also look at other scenes of spectacle. So you've got Act 1, Scene 1, which obviously the play begins with the shipwreck, and we see that visually. And then in Act 1, Scene 2, Ariel reenacts the shipwreck in words, doesn't he? So he explains to Prospero what he's been doing very proudly. And we kind of relive the shipwreck through Ariel's descriptions. We talked about this with Faustus, haven't we? And remember, Faustus is a play that comes before The Tempest, but Marlowe and Shakespeare are contemporaries. Marlowe and Shakespeare are influenced by each other. And I think both Marlowe and Shakespeare see theatre as a place where you can do both visual spectacle and linguistic spectacle, impressive poetry. And I think Ariel is an embodiment of Shakespeare's desire in this play to do both of those things. Ariel provides visual spectacle, but Ariel also at times provides that linguistic spectacle, that poetry, that kind of strong, sometimes bombastic language that Shakespeare is well known for. So any essay about magic and spectacle, I think, would be written along those lines, where Ariel was that embodiment of that. Moving on to other kind of arguments, power and freedom. Obviously, power and freedom and control are big elements of this play. And I think if we were writing an essay about that, we'd have a real opportunity to look at contrasts between Ariel and Caliban. Ariel and Caliban are the two servants in this play, and they represent different embodiments of servitude to Prospero, don't they? So William Hazlitt, who is an 18th century critic, talks about that contrast between Ariel and Caliban that Shakespeare provides. Nothing was ever more finely conceived than this contrast between the material and the spiritual, Ariel. The material Caliban and the spiritual Ariel, the gross Caliban and the delicate Ariel. So it's gross versus delicate, it's material versus spiritual, and that is the difference between Ariel and Caliban. I think, though, William Hazlitt is looking at the world through the perspective of Prospero there, right? Like Hazlitt is an 18th century critic, and he is looking at what it would be like to be the master of both Ariel and Caliban. We don't have to subscribe to that hierarchical view anymore of, Ariel is a good servant, whereas Caliban is a bad one. Caliban is gross, whereas Ariel is delicate, and therefore one is good and one is bad. So Hazlitt's view is that binary view that Prospero holds, which might seem a bit old-fashioned to a modern audience. And so maybe what you want to think about is looking at that difference between Ariel and Caliban is part of what keeps both of them in servitude. Ariel as the good, well-behaved, beautiful, delicate servant who does what he's told, and Caliban as the gross, ugly, earthy, kind of rebellious servant who has to be kept in line. Melissa E. Sanchez is a more modern kind of critic who might be useful to us, and I think this is Sanchez recognizes the thing that Ariel gets wrong about their relationship. Ariel casts their relationship as mutually binding, a contract rather than unilateral servitude. Service to Prospero is the antithesis of liberty. That's a nice phrase from Sanchez that might be worth remembering. Service to Prospero is the antithesis of liberty. So I think if I was looking at power and freedom, one argument that I would make about how power works and how freedom works is that Ariel and Caliban are both just two embodiments of the same concept, which is servitude. In Act 1, Scene 2, I think you see Prospero's control over both characters. So you'd look at how Prospero uses threats of violence and slurs and insults to keep Caliban in line. Prospero with Ariel, his kind of mastery of Ariel is more complex because he treats Ariel with respect, doesn't he? He treats Ariel almost with love, rewards him verbally, promises him his freedom, but also there is that point where he calls him a malignant thing and threatens to trap him in the tree again. So Prospero also, when it comes to it, is fine with issuing the same threats to Ariel that he does to Caliban. We might also look at the other side of this, the gross versus the delicate. A rebuttal to Hazlitt's point would be to look at Act 2, Scene 2, Caliban's short poetic monologue about his unfair treatment, where Caliban speaks in poetry. Act 3, Scene 2, which I would and other critics would argue is maybe some of the most beautiful language of the play. Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs. Caliban speaks the most beautiful poetry of the play. We see his dream of freedom. So he's not gross there, is he? Although in other scenes he is. So you've got an argument to kind of wrestle with about that presentation of Ariel and Caliban, and how Ariel definitely is presented as spiritual and delicate, and Caliban is definitely presented as gross and material, but also Shakespeare gives us room to question and challenge that framing of servitude. Thirdly, we've looked at threats to order in this play. And I think, again, it's useful to look at the contrast between Ariel and Caliban. Caliban as a non-serious threat to Prospero's power, and Ariel as Prospero's enforcer of order. And I think, again, you're looking at the difference between Ariel and Caliban that would allow you to build an argument about threats to order in this play. So if you were looking at Caliban as a non-serious threat to Prospero, you might look at Caliban's serious violent language, where he talks about slitting his throat and knocking a nail into his head, but that is framed within the drunken comic antics of Stefano and Trinculo. So you've got that kind of non-seriousness of Caliban's rebellion, even though he means it. Also in that scene, you have Ariel creating mischief and becoming Prospero's enforcer. Remember, he creates division between Stefano and Trinculo by being invisible and ventriloquizing Trinculo's voice. And then Act 4, Scene 1, you see the comic failed attempt on Prospero's life. So again, even though Caliban is serious in his own mind as a threat to Prospero's power, Shakespeare frames the threat to Prospero's power as non-serious, because he's doing that through the comic scenes. Hargest is useful here. The presence of Caliban in the Stefano Trinculo scenes allows Shakespeare to use the murder subplot to reinforce the dark conspiratorial world of the play and emphasise the important themes of the master-servant relationship and the elusive nature of power and freedom. So Caliban is being used as kind of a symbol of threats to order, but Caliban himself as a character never actually becomes a serious threat. Lastly, obviously the ending of the play, forgiveness and reconciliation. And again, we could think about the difference between Ariel and Caliban. We could use Ariel and Caliban as our examples of this. Ariel as the catalyst for Prospero's forgiveness, Caliban as perhaps an example of its limits. So I've mentioned to you before when I've taught the play, I think Ariel's line in Act 5, Scene 1, "Mine would, sir, were I human," is the most pivotal line in the play. It's the line that stops this play from becoming a revenge tragedy. It's the line that changes Prospero's mind and makes this a play about forgiveness rather than a play about revenge. So Ariel is the catalyst for Prospero's change of heart. At the same time, Caliban might be an example of the limits of Prospero's forgiveness. So he says, "This thing of darkness I acknowledge mine," which is an ambiguous way of kind of almost forgiving Caliban or creating a kind of like truce between them. But Caliban doesn't get the same level of respect or forgiveness as the nobles who have done Prospero wrong. Deborah Willis notices this. Ultimately, the play trivialises Caliban's plight. Caliban's conversion, i.e. Caliban's kind of conversion into being obedient and his apology. Caliban's conversion ensures that the moral and logical problems attendant on Prospero's seizure of the island are forgotten as the play shifts focus and celebrates the regeneration of the Milanese political order. Uncomfortable ideas here about the message of the play in the end. In order to have his message of forgiveness and reconciliation, Shakespeare has to drop any sort of radicalism, doesn't he? If the play is going to be about forgiveness and reconciliation, then what we get at the end of this play is a restoration of the natural order, i.e. the Jacobean hierarchical order. So all of these questions that Shakespeare has been asking a little bit through Caliban about Prospero's right to take the island and Caliban's right to fight back have to be neutralised, don't they, and made conservative if Shakespeare wants to have a play ending in reconciliation and not bloodshed. So you could say that Caliban is an embodiment of this idea that even though Shakespeare flirts with maybe some radical ideas about the legitimacy of the European order, ultimately Shakespeare reinforces the legitimacy of the European order. And to do that, he has to trivialise Caliban's plight. He has to make Caliban's concerns trivial and dismissible, which is what he does. So, modern post-colonial radicals can feel justified in being a bit disappointed in Shakespeare's kind of lack of radical ending, perhaps. Right, so what we've got there is lots of different arguments about kind of the different things that you could write about. So hopefully what I've tried to do there is, no matter what the question is, or no matter what the theme is, there might be things to say about Ariel and Caliban and scenes to revise if you wanted to build some arguments about 4 of our 5 main themes. Our other main theme was love, and I'm not sure that love would be the best, that Ariel and Caliban would be the best things to talk about for love. That's why I'm going to do a video on Miranda and Ferdinand too. So I've shared with you some of the critics from the booklet, and I've talked to you about how I might have done AO1 and AO5. Moving on then, we're going to do a different colour. I thought we'd just have a look at a couple of moments so that we could think about examining AO2 methods, because obviously this is your 15 mark question as well. This is that element of it. So here's a scene from Act 1, Scene 2, where Ariel does the thing that I mentioned before, which is he reenacts the shipwreck linguistically for Prospero. So you've got Ariel and Prospero there talking to each other. I think maybe a useful idea might be to look at this scene and think about some of the key things that Shakespeare does. So if you think about the shared lines there, Ariel in all his quality has to have spirit. You've got that shared line which shows the link between Ariel and Prospero, which shows that kind of mutual respect between them. You've got the you and thou, haven't you? And you've got an interesting use of thou to answer thy best pleasure, says Ariel. Ariel is particularly powerful at this moment, so he talks to Prospero like Prospero is his equal, and Prospero does that back. Hast thou, spirit, performed to the point that Tempest that I bade thee. I think that is the shared T form of two people who see each other as friends and equals, which is kind of strange given that Prospero is his master, but makes sense in this context because Ariel is talking about how powerful he is and how he's equally magical. In terms of patterns of imagery, I think always with Ariel, the thing to look at is the dynamic, like the dynamism in the language, the kind of the idea that there's all sorts of kind of verbs going through this about Ariel describing how powerful he is, burn in many places, meet and join. So now on the beat, now in the waist, now in the deck, in every cabin, you've got this kind of really dynamic kind of language around Ariel's movement. And always with Ariel, you've got the imagery of both air and fire. I flamed amazement, would I flame distinctly? So Ariel is always kind of associated with kind of the elements, but not the earth, like the air and fire. So what I'm going to suggest that you do with AO2 is, there's an example of some things that you might look at and say in Act 1, Scene 2. And if you have a look at doing that yourself for at least two other key moments involving Ariel. So you might want to go back to the scenes I suggested about Ariel on the blue slides that I talked about earlier and just find some examples. We've then got a scene with Caliban, and we might want to look at the same thing. We've got shared lines again here. This is Caliban kind of talking about how he's treated by Prospero. And again, you've got the shared line, but it's not a shared line of intimacy this time. It's a shared line of the two of them arguing. It's a kind of fast-paced argument. So you've got the rest of the island, thou most lying slave. Prospero jumps straight in to get his viewpoint across after Caliban has kind of talked about how badly treated he is. You have got you versus thou, and again you've got an interesting you versus thou here. So this island's mine which thou takes from me, when thou camest first thou strokest me. Caliban is talking to Prospero as though he's his equal there, because Caliban is asserting himself as king of the island. But later in this, Caliban almost, you can see his power waning there in his own mind, because all the charms light on you. I am all the subjects that you have. Here you stymie in this hard rock. So when Caliban is admitting that Prospero is more powerful than he is, he starts using that kind of you form to suggest that Prospero is above him. And then Prospero affirms that with thou most lying slave. Again, if we look at patterns of imagery for Caliban, we've constantly got this kind of back and forth with Caliban, that sometimes he speaks in poetry and he uses beautiful language. So to name the bigger light and how the less, I love the fresh springs, brine pits, barren place and fertile. So Caliban is definitely not this kind of mindless beast, but also, unlike Ariel, you've got him associated with the earth, haven't you? You've got the hard rock, toads, beetles, I guess bats aren't, but toads and beetles and the hard rock. Caliban is definitely kind of really earthbound in terms of Shakespeare's imagery, so you'd probably end up talking about that. And again, the other thing that I'd say is maybe choose two other moments with Caliban, do a little bit of work on that, look at the ones that I've mentioned on the blue slides, and just have a look at a couple more moments, have a look at the things that you can see in terms of the imagery. The biggest takeaway that I want you to take from these two is maybe in terms of the way you talk about Caliban and Ariel, you're going to be looking quite a lot for Ariel's imagery being associated with fire and air, and Caliban's imagery being associated with like the earth. I guess water too for Ariel, if you wanted to look at it that way. I'm trying to go quickly because I've got a few more slides to just show you. In our study of Faustus and Enron, we talked quite a lot about how you don't always have to quote from the play directly in terms of analysing the language. You should do that in your essay, but you've also got the opportunity to talk about stagecraft. So I was thinking about stagecraft methods, and I thought about stagecraft methods for Caliban in particular. So I think another thing that you could talk about, if you wanted to talk about Ariel and Caliban and power and hierarchy, look at the symbolism of the logs. The logs that he carries are a visual symbol of Caliban's enslavement. And Shakespeare does something interesting with those logs because he uses them in part of that pantomime with Ferdinand. So the logs link and contrast Caliban with Ferdinand. Caliban is an unacceptable match to Miranda. And so his carrying of the logs is associated with what is his actual job, which is a slave. Ferdinand is considered a suitable match for Miranda. So Ferdinand's carrying of the logs becomes this noble act and actually is not really that serious because Prospero doesn't really mean it and he's just using it to get them to kind of love each other. So you've got the use of the logs kind of linking Caliban with Ferdinand but contrasting them in terms of their suitability and their class. Shakespeare's use of Prospero's clothing is also useful. The clothing distracts Stefano and Trinculo at the end from their rebellion, but the clothing doesn't distract Caliban. He's not interested in it. Maybe there's an element there that Caliban does mean his kind of rebellion, and he's less corruptible than the Europeans. And lastly, you talk about Shakespeare's use of the rock. So he talks about being chained to the rock, doesn't he, and kind of stayed in a rock. It's a visual symbol of Caliban's affinity with the earth in contrast with Ariel's affinity with air and fire. So again, you're looking at the idea of AO2 being stagecraft as well as language, and I think there are three perhaps things there that you could talk about. I'm looking at time, and I wanted to just mention one more thing, and it reflects the idea that AO3 is really important in this Tempest essay. So I'm going to go through as quickly as I can some AO3 ideas that you should know about and that you should be able to talk about in a developed way with Ariel and Caliban. So I've got 8 things I want to say about context with Ariel and Caliban. Firstly, I wanted to talk about Caliban and ideas of where Caliban comes from. So one place that Caliban comes from is from Michel de Montaigne's essay. Shakespeare would have read Montaigne's essay from the 1580s, which questioned notions of savagery in the stories brought back by European colonisers of the New World. Critics have suggested that Shakespeare made up Caliban's name as a near anagram of cannibal. So Montaigne's point, if you remember, was that all of these Europeans were coming back from the Americas and giving these and telling these strange stories about cannibals and kind of savages and subhuman people. And Montaigne wanted to question that idea of savagery and wanted to maybe think about how, you know, maybe the people in the New World were just different with a different set of values, and that actually Europeans were the savage ones because they were going around killing and burning these other kind of settlements and civilizations. So Montaigne very early on is questioning colonialism, and perhaps that is why Shakespeare also wants to have that ambiguity with Caliban about whether he is a monster or whether he is a misunderstood human. This also links with a concept that becomes much more popular later on over the next couple of hundred years as colonialism ramps up in Europe, which is the idea of the noble savage. So there's a trope in Western literature which thinks about that difference between civilization and non-civilization. The idea of the noble savage, the idea that you might look at the other as a European colonizer and see humanity in its purest form, to see humanity uncorrupted by civilization or society. So the noble savage is perhaps a well-intentioned European idea in the sense that it tries to find the good in the other rather than just enslaving them. But a post-colonial critic would say that the noble savage idea is probably equally racist, just in a different way. It's the idea that it kind of reduces people from other backgrounds as these kind of romanticized caricatures. So the noble savage is perhaps a liberal idea from the 16th and 17th century that is still rooted in ideas of racial hierarchy. And maybe that is also something that Shakespeare is wrestling with. A less racially problematic source for Caliban might come from the idea of the Wadwo. That's a medieval English kind of fable character, and that's a type of wild man who lives in the wilderness or woodlands and acts kind of in this kind of wild, uncontrolled, uncivilized way. So it's not always about kind of a racial other. When you look at Caliban, it might be looking at kind of the idea of civilization within England or within Europe. Then we've got Ariel as the harpy. So Shakespeare's knowledge of classical literature means that this choice of the harpy is really deliberate. Harpies were sent by Zeus to punish wrongdoers in classical literature and Greek myth. So if Prospero is this classical god with the power to dispense divine justice, then Ariel is his messenger, and Ariel as the harpy is kind of rooted in ancient Greek culture. AO3 in terms of the performance context, so we've got the Blackfriars Theatre, the first performance in 1611. I would say that a character like Ariel gives Shakespeare the opportunity to exploit the different technology of the Blackfriars Theatre. They would have been suspending the actors on wires from the ceiling. They would have been able to use more spectacular things like sound effects and costume and stuff like that, having that more intimate space. So a character like Ariel is maybe something that Shakespeare is creating in order to kind of make that Blackfriars Theatre space a little bit more spectacular. In the same way, you've got then 2 years later the kind of rewrite for the 1613 royal wedding of Princess Catherine. So in the same way, if that play was rewritten for the royal wedding, Shakespeare taps into that idea of the Renaissance masque, lavish elite celebrations with costume, music, dancing. Ariel's shape-shifting ability also allows Shakespeare to kind of play with spectacle in that way as well, and that's why Ariel appears as the goddess. Lastly, a couple of kind of, I guess we're blending AO3 with AO5 here. So you've got Amy Cesare, who's from Martinique in the Caribbean, a French language writer. He wrote Une Tempête as a response to the Tempest in 1969. Ariel and Caliban literally represent those kind of colonized peoples, so natives of a colonized island. Caliban is a violent revolutionary, whereas Ariel kind of more collaborates, or is at least less kind of antagonistic, which is what happens in the play. Cesare changes the ending of the Tempest, where Prospero frees Ariel for his good behaviour, but stays on the island to retain control of Caliban. So it's a bit of a bleaker post-colonial view. And Amy Cesare wanted to really exploit the idea that the Tempest may have been the first play about colonialism ever written. Lastly, queer readings of Ariel are quite interesting. So Ariel's otherness might be less rooted racially and more rooted in his fluidity. Ariel is fluidity as a human, really, isn't he? But that also means that he's fluid in terms of gender. So Ariel does refer to himself as he one time in the play, but he also transforms into female characters like the Harpy and Juno. And his question to Prospero, "Do you love me?" which seems to come out of nowhere in Act 3, might also suggest a kind of queer reading in regard to their relationship, and the reason why Ariel kind of stays with him despite the bad treatment. So there are queer readings of Ariel which you could think about as well. I've tried to rush there at the end because I know I'm running out of time, and I've kind of gone over what I thought. So just as a final thought, what we'll be doing is using these videos to write about the Tempest. So everything that I've just said there, have a look at kind of how this might fit in with your existing notes, make new notes if you need to. Then go through your booklet and look at all the possible past exam questions which are listed in your booklet. Which exam questions specifically would allow you to build arguments about Ariel and Caliban, and how has that video helped you to build arguments, use critics, examine methods, and bring in context. I am going to have to leave it there because it's going to cut me off in a minute anyway. And as I've said, I'm trying very hard to kind of keep these videos short. I have not succeeded with this one, but I'll try again with Miranda and Ferdinand. Don't forget to like and subscribe.